to Unmoored, America Adrift in historical forgetfulness and finding our way back. In this
The focus, the flow of what we're looking at here is me addressing a problem. And the problem is, it's my contention. And I think it's obvious. We're going to walk through that. But I think casual observation would suggest that U.S. society and culture is in peril. As a nation, to me, it seems like we're adrift at sea, kind of using that metaphor, hence unmoored as the title. We're unmoored from the safety and the protection of a good harbor, of a dock set upon a stable foundation. I think this has been happening because over the past 4 or 5 decades, perhaps longer, knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of our corporate history, both the nation's history and the history's foundation, has fallen so that there is no longer a correct comprehension or a maybe accurate, deep understanding, a chest-level understanding of the events of our founding, especially as it relates to its roots and where Christianity plays a role in those roots. The podcast is my attempt to help us, both you and I and the listeners and the nation perhaps, focus on the missing historical truths that point to what I think are necessary stances, positions, or foundational elements of what constitutes a healthy civic society, as well as a healthy individual life. Kind of what is a flourishing society with flourishing individuals. And what I'm hoping I can be is like a guide. Often when I'm speaking and teaching about history, because I do that often, people are like, well, I never knew that. Or I wish somebody had told me that. Or I wish I had remembered that from grammar school. So we're going to look at evidence through the entire podcast that is the actual evidence that I think when we reflect on it, it tells us, oh, so that's what they were thinking. That was what was going on, as opposed to just an opinion of that. And it's a true story. That's the whole point, is that we're looking for the evidence, and it's a true story that I believe many people have either not seen at all, or they've forgotten, or they've just never investigated it deeply. They have a surface-level knowledge. Sort of like people have a surface-level knowledge of playing chess. They may be reading a new book on Tolkien and kind of his underlying philosophy. And you know, in Lord of the Rings alone, according to this expert, all right, Peter Kreeft, he says that there are over 500 references within Lord of the Rings, so the 3-volume set, which is actually a 1-volume set, but was published in 3 volumes, to that land's history. So if you know Tolkien, you know he wrote another book called The Silmarillion, and that's really kind of the history. And then there's all kinds of other writings that Tolkien's son Christopher ultimately published. If you've gone to a bookstore and you look for Tolkien writings, there are dozens and dozens of different books, and they're all about the history that is behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings. So Kreeft writes this: Tolkien's heroes are humble and therefore look to the past, to the wisdom they had been given. His villains and fools are proud and therefore scorn tradition and look only within themselves for their wisdom. And if you review Tolkien just from this point of history, you see this again and again and again, where Gandalf and Aragorn and Frodo and Bilbo and Legolas, they're always talking about what lessons they learned from the past, failures from the past, how to correct things, how the past can guide them. The United States in the 1950s, but from a Christian point of view, that's not the golden age. And yet, when you hear people today talk, sometimes it feels like, again, they're thinking, hey, it's the time to go back to.
Yeah.
Right? Or, I mean, you and I have quoted some of the founders. So some people might say, oh, no, if we just could go back to 1776, that was the time. And I would again, I'd suggest to Christians, no, that's not the time. There's not been a time, particularly, here comes the guy I want to introduce today, post-Constantine, that we could say the church has been living out this minority culture point of view. So ultimately, I want to take us back to about 1,800 years ago.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to be looking at some Roman history today.
Love it.
And the part of this that I'm trying to stress is to point out to people, again, on the sort of conservative Christian, i.e. Christian nationalist side, you're asking for something that only became true post-Constantine. And spoiler alert, that turned out to be a terrible outcome for Christianity as a faith and for the collective thing we call the church. They believed that they could discover things because they believed in an ordered, designed world that had discoverable elements. But I'll just leave that there for now. The myth of a unity of science, that there's only one logical path to knowledge, And I guess the point I want to make is that they believe that human history is kind of a record of general progress. You hear this all often from people, that there's an arc to history, there's a direction for history. And the reality is that that's inaccurate. That's not the story when you look at the historical record. When you look at antiquity, really what you discover is that the human is much the same. There's heroes and villains. There's moments of brilliance and moments of darkness. There's technological understanding and know-how from some of our earliest historical societies. In some cases, things that we still either now are just figuring out or had lost and rediscovered, so that we rediscovered it. We're not brilliant. We're just catching up to where folks were 4,000 years ago. But just think of them as truth tellers about what God thinks.
No, yes, they were so popular.
They were not at all.
They didn't.
Nobody liked these people. And what they consistently said, and it depends on where you start. There's some famous ones and there's some less famous ones. You got about 500 years-ish of them wagging their finger, not at the non-Christians or the non-God people, at the God people,
God's people,
saying, yo, y'all are not doing the right thing. All right?
Yeah.
So this has been something I've been very interested in for a long time. And so for over the past couple of years, I really said, I want to dig into this. Because again, if I'm a Christian and I feel in the year 2024 that I'm in the minority culture, and I wonder, has somebody done, it's Hollywood's fault, it's those lefties, it's communism, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Well, is there something I can learn from my own faith's journey's history? What happened that the prophets were pointing out? And spoiler alert, at the end, the people don't fix anything. Sure. And by the way, like us today, a lot of Christians, conservative Christians today, there are people going, why this happened? Why this happened? Why this happened? And there were some people who wanted to use kind of force, control, take over to fix the problem. In other words, the problem isn't us. The problem is somebody else. But God's own voice to them, again, by their own records of these prophets, is like, yeah, that's not the story. The role of how do you do the moral virtue thing without having a state religion? Because that's the normative state also. So the normative position, we use the word religion, and people think in terms of Christian religion. But if you just think about kind of an ideology about afterlife and virtue and God or gods, every society had something like that. Franklin, in the time of writing the Constitution, is there. He's the oldest guy in the room. And they're debating on the very last day whether or not they should stay or not stay, or how do we get this across the line? How do we get it ratified? And in the journey of kind of walking through that, he wanted to help people understand that he thought this was a good document. And so he has this really long, wonderful speech about unity and about how to help it get across the line. But towards the end of his little writing, his speech, he said that the Constitution will be, he believes, successful. However, it would only last so long, or it would run the risk of failing, quote, when the people shall become so corrupted. So in other words, he's taking it in a different direction. It'll work as long as we have virtue and morality. I think that when you really press into saying, what are these problems, the things we mentioned last time and in this conversation today about the idea of there being a civic foundation that I suggest we've lost, is that these problems are of a spiritual nature. The citizens of the United States, we don't like talking about issues of a spiritual nature. It makes us nervous. But we cannot turn away from that. And to be clear, what I'm trying to say is that our problems are not solved by who we elect or what governance rules can we make. In fact, the idea that to say we can fix these problems by new government laws is the normative power pyramid structure. We will enforce a morality on everybody. Because remember I told you last time, all laws enforce morality.
Yeah, top down.
The founders, the other way around. The solution then, when we say it's of a spiritual nature, thinking back to the corruption that Franklin said, or the idea of virtue that Washington said, is that it's on individual level. As Adam said, it only works when there's virtue on the private, meaning for the individual. So these are interior things, and we have to own this. We have to be brave enough to say, all right, let me look. If I'm not a Christian, I need to be brave enough to say, tell me what was the value of this Christianity in these various groups that came here. Like, why was this so central to them? What we hope happens through this episode, not just this episode, but all the whole series really, is to rediscover certain key historical truths that can guide us. If not backwards, because I understand people going, I don't want to go backwards, but the idea back to safe harbor, but forwards to a safe harbor. How do we do that? What's the right way to do that? And we talked last time about foundation and about how that's necessary, but in particular, it's necessary for a civic structure like we are engaged in, and that history is a guide.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.